Good afternoon. I'm Al McFarland. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarland. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Let me start by inviting you to invite everybody you know to tune into this program. It's going to be a rich, robust conversation. The focus is Africatown, and the story is a phenomenal story. We all are connected to the story in one way or another, and you don't want to miss it. What I want you to do also is to subscribe to this channel. And if you're joining us on any other digital platforms, say if you're on Facebook or if you're on LinkedIn or Twitter, which we're streaming to, take a minute, take a second, and scroll over to the Insight YouTube channel. We've got around 300 subscribers right now. We want to grow that to 1,000, and you taking the time to subscribe moves us in that direction. You also telling your friends, your colleagues, people that you connect with, that we're doing something important here, creating community, having robust conversations, articulating our point of view, our expectations, our analyses. We're building community, building futures, co-authoring the existences that we deserve and that we desire. Well, join us, and thank you for being here. Spread the word. I want to start today, as we often do, with a hot topic. I have one thing pulled up to share. I don't want to spend a lot of time because it's such a great program and great guests today. But I want to point out that a news story published today, a couple of days ago, talks about Governor Walz highlighting how his Minnesota budget plans help Black Minnesotans. And this is an article published, I think, on what day? A couple of days ago, February 6th, and from, I think, the Minneapolis St. Paul magazine. I believe that's where it comes from. But the article says Marquita Stokes says she was convinced Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan wanted to do more to help the Black community, not by what they said, but what they did. And what they did was they listened. She says, I saw that they wanted to do something positive. I wanted to be part of that, said Stokes, who joined a group called Mind, Body, and Soul that worked for the past year to identify specific things that state government could do to address the disparities affecting Black residents. Led by Stephanie Burridge, a deputy commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Education, Robert Doty, former commissioner at the State Department of Revenue, and other Black community leaders. The group started off in January of 2022 with about 130 members, and it grew to about more than 650. Barrage said Black Minnesotans wanted a consistent voice at the table. They wanted to see tangible changes and not just discussion. They wanted to see resources made available to communities at large. I'll close this just with this note. This is about the racial disparities in Minnesota. They are glaring. This article goes on to say that Minnesota has long struggled with glaring racial disparities in income, employment, educational attainment, home ownership, and more. State lawmakers have struggled to find the best ways to address those gaps. Governor Walz called the group's input essential in his $64 billion two-year budget proposal and how it expands programs to improve racial equity. The governor said it was important. The group had ownership of the process and the ideas that came out of it. He said, quote, this wasn't going to be an old white guy coming into the Black community saying this is how we're going to do it. And he said that some of the criticisms of government, however, were tough to hear because that's what people were saying about it. Well, we'll stop there. You can check that out. I think you can find it on insightnews.com, or we'll let you know where to find the story. But it's important. What's important is that right now the state has a $17.8 billion budget surplus. And the question we have to raise to ourselves and to the state is, how do we ensure that our community gets its share? We put the money in, we got to get the money out. It's about the money, and it's about equity. Equity can be measured in dollars. So that's what we're talking about. Well, let me shift to the main focus of today's program when I'm bringing my colleague and my friend, my companion, Dr. Irma McClaurin. Dr. Irma, good to see you, my friend. And you have curated a wonderful program today. And I'll ask you to kind of co-lead with me so that we, between us, cover a variety of things of importance. You and I started talking about, number one, you're in Mobile right now, I believe. Or,
Yes.
yeah. And I had mentioned to you that I had read as part of the In Class with Her on narrative.com, the Barracoon book. Barracoon, the book by Zora Neale Hurston that chronicles the story of the last Black cargo. And this piece was just important for all kinds of reasons. Well, you've been personally connected with Zora Neale,
Yes.
her work. And I want to start with that. Talk about why you're there and what your connection is to uh, uh, Zora Neale Hurston, and where we are today. And I'll have you help me introduce our two special guests today.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. And basically, I now have a new hashtag called Bama Roots Girl. I'm in Mobile because I'm discovering my Alabama roots. My mother was born in Peachtree, which is about 2 hours outside of Mobile. And I'm here because I have an uncle who is my mother's last living sibling. And so we were here to work with him. And then I began to realize and hearing about the Africatown that there is such a connection to the research that I've been doing on Zora Neale Hurston for about 3 decades now. And she writes letters to Langston Hughes from Magazine, Alabama, which is really the area that Africatown is located in. So I've been building upon that connection and got in touch, was actually introduced to Dr. Gnammankou, who's going to be in the show, who's from Benin. And he is a Fulbright visiting scholar at the University of South Alabama, and beginning to see these connections. And he told me about the book, Remembering Africa, that we're going to be talking with the author about, who is a descendant. So it's real people talking about real things, and all of them recognize that the work that Zora Neale Hurston did was immensely important, immensely important.
And that work was suppressed for years and years. Tell us about that, if you would, Dr. McLaurin.
Well, one of Zora's contributions is that she really elevated the cultural contributions of Negro people, then that's what we call them, in the American South. And in particular, she really wanted to capture and preserve the language, the linguistic contribution that Black people had invented a new language. You know, we call it Ebonics. In other places, they call it Creole, but in people making the connection, you know, trying to transform themselves from Africans with their own language into trying to communicate in this new world that they were brought to involuntarily. They're not immigrants; they were enslaved people. But in fashioning this language, she was really taken by Kojo's and Kosulo's remembrance and his way of speaking. And she wanted, when she wrote up her notes about him and started talking about telling his story, she did 2 things that were unique. One is that she took herself out of the narrative, that she felt it was really important that it be his story as told to her. And the second thing is that she wanted to retain the linguistic integrity of how he had created, you know, basically adapted by learning this new language, but also retaining aspects of Africanism, of his original language. And that was the book that she sent to her publishers. And they were not interested in publishing something in which the cultural language of enslaved African people was the way in which it was being presented. And essentially they said, if you whiten it, if you turn it into standard English, make it acceptable, then we'll publish it. And Zora stuck to her guns. She felt that the integrity of how Kojo told his story was a critical part of it. And she said no. And so it languished in the Library of Congress I think it wasn't even copyrighted at that point. She wanted to copyright it, and she always had a challenge for having money. So it basically sat in a file until it was discovered. I think it was published again in 2018. So something like 4, 5, 6 decades after she had written it, it's finally seen the light of day in the original form that she had intended. So that the voice we hear is not Zora's voice, it's not made up, but it is in fact Kojo Lewis, also known as Caluso.
And a powerful story indeed. Let me bring in a person connected directly to the story, but I say, as we all are, Brother Kojo Adisa. Brother Kojo is a native of Mobile, Alabama. He's a graduate of the University of South Alabama. He's a Navy disabled veteran. I'm a Navy veteran. We can talk about that down the road. A highly decorated and distinguished federal agent spanning 2 decades. He's an entrepreneur and author, a former radio co-host on 1580 AM. And today he's a sought-after public speaker sharing his insights on geopolitics, health, spirituality, community, and unity. So in his book, Re-Embracing Africa, Answering African Dreams from the Coffin Clotilda, he addresses with a passion what his ancestors endured through incarceration in Africa, the transatlantic voyage, the Middle Passage, we call it, and bondage in America. And through this, through memory and African-centered principles, they were able to establish Africatown, USA. Brother Kojo, good afternoon. Welcome to the conversation with Al McFarlane. How you doing, man?
Hello, Brother Al. Thank you so much, Baba. I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate the time that you're giving me to speak. If I can do one thing in way of governance, please.
Yes.
It's an African governance, and I learned this as well through my ancestors as well as through traveling to Africa. But this is your show, and I want to represent well the ancestry. But brother, can I have the permission to speak?
Absolutely, please. Of course.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And Professor Irma McClaurin, I really do appreciate your time. And I so completely appreciate the efforts, the time spent that you spent with Zora Hurston's full story. As you mentioned, a lot of this story would not have been captured if not for Zora Neale Hurston and the way that she documented the story. As you mentioned, she documented it in the language of the person she was interviewing. And she didn't so much use her own voice. And I think it was probably whatever's in the whirlwinds of the ancestors that the book came out now, because it was so hard for her to get it out then. And it's important still now. So the presence of when it came out and when it was actually published, I think is very honorable for her legacy. For her legacy that she has shared. I want to say this is that again, as you mentioned, I go by Kojo Adisa, an open market for African ways of knowing. My name given by my parents is John Bako, or you can just call me John. But I do go by Kojo. And the book that I drafted, of course, Re-Embracing Africa is the key word. That's what my message kind of centers around, is re-embracing this. It's not a notion, as some people would take it. It's not a idea. It is that African is African is African. And I think by the book that Zora Neale Hurston put out, it definitely resonates that is what I used, my aunts and my grandmother said, call him Uncle Kojo. And so I call him Uncle. Now we know Kosala was from the area of Benin or even Nigeria. But man, thank you guys for having me.
Well, you in the pre-show conversation that we had talked about, for you, it's critical that we discuss the creation of Africatown. But really, this conversation precedes that. It's about our identity, our history, our legacy as African people. Go into that, if you would. Go deeper into that.
Oh, absolutely. So let me add to this to that piece. I'll jump to Africa in just one moment. Is the fact that how do I fall into this puzzle? I fall into this puzzle by lineage of my father.
Mm-hmm.
My father's mother, my grandmother, was the daughter to Kupelu. And a lot of will say, or sometimes you hear the name Poli Allen. Kupelu Allen is my great-grandfather. He married a young lady by the name of Lucy. It would be his second wife. And he had 10 children. Those 10 children is my grandmother. Her mother, though, was, if you read the books, it's Abache. And so between Abache and Kupelu, they were the ones on this coffin that came from Africa to the United States. And as you mentioned, Baba McFarlane, is the concept that I love to speak on is that we're African, our DNA and our essence is African. We may be in America, that's cool. And I wouldn't challenge if you're in Cuba, if you're in Canada, wherever you are, if you have the essence of an African hue, skin tone, color, well, then you know that you are a piece of the homeland. And before they actually came to this land, they were doing things in Africa. They weren't just like sitting around, hanging out. They were working individuals. And something that Irma just brought up is really important. I'm sorry, Professor. What she just brought up is when she said the way that Kusala was able to take the language and then incorporate some aspects of his African language possibly, and incorporate and then speak in the English version. But one of the things I learned, which is talking about what can we do as an African way of knowing, is that when you visit Africa and you go and you meet the people, you will find that your family, your kinship in Africa, they speak at least 3 different languages.
Mm-hmm.
Now in America, we kind of, unless you go to school and you learn French or Spanish and what have you, we are only stuck kind of like with English, right? But when they came here, they probably spoke some dialect of their hometown. So most in Africa, they have a home language, their community language. It might be Fon. It might be an aspect of Yoruba. The Iwu might say, speak a little differently, but they have their language. That's number 1. 2, and as you study the history of Africa, you know that the Arabs invaded Africa at one point in time. So a lot of the guys spoke Arabic. But even before the invasion, you have to realize they were traders on the territory, especially on the coastal territories. They spoke Portuguese, which is Spanish primarily, but that they could always do more than one thing. And that's why I always encourage other individuals, especially in America, speak more than one language. Try to get that, because when you go to Africa, and especially when you go to those the markets that they have there, oh my God, you have these guys coming up to you or ladies coming up to you, and they're speaking to you maybe in English, and you're like, oh my God, you speak English, but then they can flip right around and talk to the person right next to you who speaks Arabic, and they can do it with ease.
Just like that, yeah.
And I would co-sign that, because this is what I observed when I went to the Caribbean. Curacao, which is a Dutch-speaking island, is an example. Is that I'm at the hotel desk and the clerk is speaking to me in English, and then she will turn and speak to someone in Dutch, and then they also have their own creolized language that they use. And so suddenly this one person, who's not like a foreign traveler, investor, but just an everyday person, including the taxi drivers, and they are multilingual. And I think that is an aspect of something that Zora also recognized. She wasn't just a cultural anthropologist, but she was also a linguistic anthropologist. And she recognized, she was writing to Langston Hughes saying, Black folk here in the South, in Alabama and other places, are inventing language. A lot of what they did was to take descriptive adjectives like comb to comb, and put it together with a noun, hair, and suddenly you have hair comb, cooking pot. These terms that we now take for granted as part of the American vernacular were actually words that were created by Black people, not by just generic Americans. And Zora was documenting all of this, and Caluso becomes a prime example of how he's doing this as well. And so there's several things that are happening. It is not just him telling his story, but we are seeing the ingenuity, the adaptability, the creativity that Zora believed was very much inherent in African culture manifest itself in his story.
Let me bring in our other guest today, and that's Dr. Dieudonné Gnammankou, who is a Beninese historian and translator, born in 1963 in Côte d'Ivoire. He studied in the former Soviet Union, earning his Master of Arts degree in Russian philology and literature, Russian language, and literature. Also a degree in Russian French translation from the Patrice Lumumba University, which is called People's Friendship University in Moscow. And he's listed as one of the 20 notable alumni since 1960 of People's Friendship University of Russia. He's got a remarkable, amazing career of accomplishment, achievement. His work has centered on African studies and the history of the African diaspora. In 1966, he published a seminal biography of the Russian military leader, Abram Petrovich Ganibal. I'm saying that right, I think. And, the Russian translation coincided with the 1999 bicentennial anniversary of the birth of the writer, the famed writer, Alexander Pushkin, who was Ganibal's great-grandson. His research established that Ganibal was born in Logon Birni, Central Africa, an area bordering on Lake Chad, which is now Cameroon. Well, we'll talk about that. And the question, Dr. Gnammankou, is how we connect your study, your work, the use, the power, the need to understand language, and what language is and what it does in creating community and creating imagination, creating facility of being, and how we grasp that in a way that allows and encourages us to be masters of our own destiny and creators of a future in which we win. First of all, Brother Doctor, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me at your program. Yes, you mentioned so many important things, and it's true that the language helps us be ourselves. The language is one of the greatest markers of our identity. So, for instance, my research on the African diaspora couldn't have got the success I had without the help of the languages, the help of the knowledge of the languages. For instance, when I work on Russian poet of African descent, Alexander Pushkin, ancestry, African ancestry, it was three words from the African language, which was spoken by Pushkin's great-grandfather. Those three words would help me to determine his place of birth in Africa, in the Lake Chad area. This was the name of the river, where was located the city of his birth. This was the name of his sister, and the name also of the city where he was born. So it is important for us, of course, to know our languages. And in the process of the deportation of Africans and the enslavement in the Americas, the slave plantation owners did all the best to prevent Africans not to speak the languages. They had to speak only English or Spanish or Portuguese. As Kojo was saying, Brother Kojo Adisa, author of the book, was saying a few minutes ago, most of African Americans today speak only English. So there's a kind of Creole language. We at least, you know, even through the accent, the way of speaking, the African American have the way of speaking English. So at least this way of speaking, it's a marker of a kind of resistance they had, you know, it's an heritage, a legacy of the resistance during the era of the slave trade and the era of the enslavement of Africans in the Americas. And in African families, it's true that more often children will speak different languages because the mother and the father very often don't speak the same language. So children have to speak the mother language, the father language. When you go to the market, you will hear another language. So the trade language in the markets is in many cases in another language. So automatically, children speak 3 languages, and the identity, of course, is focused. The languages allow them to define themselves, to know the knowledge the ancestors has put in the languages. And it's not by accident that during the colonization of Africa, the colonial powers also did everything to avoid the use of African languages in the school system until now. See, I'm speaking English now. In Benin, we speak French, which was a colonial language, till now in the school system, though our countries are independent.
It would be good to learn more about Africatown, you know, the naming of that space, Brother Kojo. And I would like you and Dr. Gnammankou and Dr. Irma McClaurin to also talk about the parallel, the significance of the story of Africatown, these men and women who arrived on that coffin and their descendants, and relate that to your work in the connecting of the great Alexander Pushkin to his roots in Benin or in Cameroon, right?
Yes.
And so what is the meaning of that, and how do we figure in both the will and the power of the ancestors in connecting us and reconnecting us to knowledge of ourselves, and how that may benefit the building of community that we currently undertake? Brother Kojo, you first, and then Dr. Irma, and then back to Dr. Gnammankou.
Well, thank you for that question. And as you mentioned,
and start with Africatown. Let's go more into Africatown. That story is so fascinating.
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to. So the initial city or town was called Plateau. Okay, Plateau, Alabama. And there's a unique piece about Plateau I'll get to in a moment. But Plateau, Alabama, during the Civil War, the name became Magazine Point. And that's kind of what Professor McClaurin was mentioning a little earlier, that, hey, you know, the letters from Zora Hurston were from Magazine Point. But there's a reason why it was called Magazine Point, is because that's where they had stored ammunitions during the Civil War. And actually the same family that commissioned this particular trip, they actually owned the properties that had these ammunitions on them. And because
stop there if you would. Let's sit with commissioned the trip. That's the backstory. So tell that first, and then we'll keep going back to come back to this point.
Okay, well, you have some prominent individuals who already own property, and which is a great thing. They already own land, they already own businesses. But of course, right around the 1820s and the 1830s, when King Cotton was pretty big. And of course, you still had in the United States this thing called bondage. I don't like to say slaves. I say in bondage to bound. But you have this going on. Now, we all know that there was a time and point when they said, hey, you can no longer import Africans or import individuals. Let's say individuals. But there was a part in the United States where you could still trade inside the United States. Well, I kind of denote in my writing that it seems that they made a concerted effort to decide one day in 1860 that they wanted to, it was cheaper for them to commission the ship, send it to the West Coast, where they had seen in the papers that the Dahomey King had some enslaved, some bondage for sale. And they said, hey, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's do that. The key to all of that is that, as history would know, and you historians know and professors know, that you had the Anti-Slavery Act in 1807, which the United States took it on in 1808. But even more important, that's where most people start with that story. But what the real illegal act was, because 1807, 1808 act did not actually lay out what the penalty would be. It was in 1820 where the Piracy Act came into play. That's the real violation, the Piracy Act. And so Africatown, so let's just say that's 1820. Now here at 1860 again, you have this commission ship that goes over, being managed by Captain William Foster. It does arrive in the coast of Benin, or area called Odai or Weda, currently Weda. And Odai was where the ship anchored. Mr. Foster and crew, went to shore. They picked out the persons that they chose to put on the ship, and some they had to leave behind because there was a schooner offshore that they noticed. And William Foster said, "Hey, let's go ahead and get out of here before we're captured, and then we'll have to face some penalties."
Not captured, but arrested.
Arrested. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's right. Arrested. Well, captured would be a good term.
Okay.
Since that's what happened to our ancestors. They were captured.
We were captured. Yeah. I'm saying they might have been arrested. Yeah. Captured would have been good though.
Captured would have been good. But so that's really the real quick story on that one. And then when they come back and, they're then, it was 110. Now, some say it might have been 2 that passed away on that particular voyage, but they get to Mobile, Alabama. They get to this area. And so once they are disembarked from the vessel, some of them stay in the location, which is known as Plateau, Alabama, and split up among the brothers, the Meir brothers, and their other co-conspirators, the Dabneys. I think there was a Jones and what have you. They're split up. But there was a group that kind of stayed together and they bonded. And that's how, and after, so they get there, they were there, 1860, 1863, emancipation, of course, hey, thumbs up. In 1865 is when actually Uncle Kojo says, 1865, April of 1865, that the soldiers came and told them that you're free. That was in 1865. So at that point, they got together and said, hey, we're now free. They went to Mr. Meir, Timothy, the main owner, and they said, hey, now that we are free, we want you to send us back home. And then Meir said something very strange. Well, it wasn't strange because it's Alabama. He said, wait a minute, you're telling me that you want me, I've already lost property. Now I've lost property, you or my property. I lost property, and now you want me to pay for you to go back and I lose money again? He said, that's not going to happen. So then the willingness of the ancestors, which is very unique for me, they said, okay, they got together. They weren't discouraged, but that's the wrong word. They were discouraged, I'm so sure, because it's in my spirit. They were discouraged. But then what they chose to do was get together and say, well, what can we do?
Mhm.
So they decided, male, female, get together. We're going to have jobs. They get a little money. Now, we know it wasn't a lot of money, but they get that money, pool it together, and then they went and bought the property from Timothy Meir and his brother Jim Meir, and they developed this area they called Africatown.
What a story. What a story.
And I think it's really important about, I mean, what we're seeing manifested is the entrepreneurial spirit. Their desire was to go home. And at a certain point, they recognized that even if they worked, given the low wages, that they would not have enough, resources to be able to go home. So they decide to make do. But the fact that they do it collectively, that
Yes.
this is they're building upon that idea of community and being part of a village, all those things that we now sort of invoke when we use these African proverbs, they were actually doing it and manifesting it. And I think that that's really important, the way that they got together for that.
Dr. Gnammankou, in your study of the diaspora, the African diaspora, this is not an uncommon experience. We have African communities throughout the Americas, in Brazil, the Quilombos, in Peru, in, I think, obviously, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, the Caribbean, Nicaragua. Dr. Irma has done research in Belize. Talk about that. How common is this experience, and how does your writing about the African presence in Russia fit into this equation of who we have been able to be and develop a sense of self? Unmute, please. Unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes. What happened to millions of Africans who were victims of slave raids and were forcibly deported to the Americas, be it in the Caribbean, in Southern America, in Northern America? We can find distinctive patterns. And the life and achievement in the hell of enslavement, of slavery, shows that there were free men and free women who were taken, were victims of raids, and who were enslaved. So, and the way they behaved, the way they resisted, the way they fought against the inhuman system they were submitted to, they resisted permanently, and this permanent resistance can be found everywhere. So even in the hell they found themselves, they had enough strength within themselves to show the enslavers that they were, if they could be by violence physically, they could be enslaved physically, but mentally, they were still free. They remained free men, free women. And we've seen so many examples of slave rebellions, various ways of resistance all over the Americas. We remember what happened in Haiti when Africans met in 1791 in August to organize the greatest slave revolution in the history of slavery. And in Europe, what is interesting in Europe also is that it's important to know that Africans were deported in European countries before even Europeans came to the Americas. And those were those who found themselves in Russia during the imperial era were in Russia through another slave trade, through the Ottoman Empire. And they found themselves in Russia. What will they do? They'll do the same thing. They'll show who they were, that as African men and women, there were free men and free women in the countries, in the kingdoms. They'll show the strength of the tradition, the strength of the culture, and they will distinguish themselves. And one of the major things they will do, through even passive resistance or active resistance, be it through rebellion, be it through wars, being through attacks they will organize, the main thing they will permanently defend, ideas they will defend, was to deny, to show that all theories which were used to justify the enslavement were pseudo-theories, were false theories. And what Alexander Pushkin's ancestor will do in Russia, for instance, Abraham Hannibal, was he knew that in the system he was, he had to prove all his human capacities, abilities in all the fields, in technical fields, in military fields, etc., to be recognized. So he did all his best, and he became one of the most important figures of the history of Russia in the 18th century. And those ancestors did distinguish themselves, and through that, they did, how would you say, breakthrough, and they obliged the oppressors to look at them and to understand by themselves, by the example, that they were mistaken, considering those people as inferior human beings. So, you say, for instance, what could be the impact of that on us today?
Mm-hmm.
There are various examples. We saw in the history of Africans who were deported in the Ottoman Empire, for instance, the women, they have kept the tradition, the spirituality and religious traditions. And Turkish women were used to go to see those African women to learn about their own lives, because we have in West Africa Ifa.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to prove that it was very important, as they knew they didn't come without anything. They didn't have suitcases or things.
Right.
They had the head, and in the head they had everything. And what is important for us today is to know that as Africans, we have inherited all the 300,000 human history, human tradition, human achievement in all the areas of human life, human science, human arts. We bear that. Our ancestors have left this legacy to us. So it's important for us to remember that, to remember them. And when we remember the ancestors, we also need to know the way we have to pay tribute to them, so that they hear us and they help us to continue facing the modern challenges we face now.
I love just sitting with the word remembering. And to me, Dr. Gnammankou, the notion of remembering takes it to a different level. On the one hand, you say, oh, I forgot, oh, I remember. But one of my teachers here in Minnesota talked in one of our programs about hearing and using the concept differently. And he said, think about dismember, then think about remember. That in history, the experience that we Africans underwent at the hands of the colonizers was a dismembering of our spirits, of our body, of our story, of our lineage. And now the challenge remains, and the challenge is to remember, to reconnect. And that as we reconnect, we then can take and have a sense of sovereignty, a sense of ownership, of equity, as you have described, Doctor, understanding that we've got a 3,000 plus year experience in creating civilization. One of my first times in Africa, I think it was '94. I went to Ghana on a student and elders trip by an organization here called the Stair Step Foundation. They partnered adults with teenagers to have an experience going back and learning, or not going back, but going to Ghana and connecting in community. And one of the things I took away from that first experience was there were signs all over the airport and throughout the country promoting Panafest. I hadn't heard of it before, but the theme that year was the rebirth of African civilization. And so that's about being conscious, right? Being intentional. And thank you, Afia Zakia. She writes of Ikwe Arma, writes of remembering the dismembered continent. Yes, we must remember. So I love this conversation about memory and what memory does. And Kojo, we talk about memory as a core element of the governance structure, what we mean to each other, and how we build futures based on knowledge, an Africana way of knowing. Kojo, what do you think? Jump in here.
Oh, no, you hit the nail on the head. Remembering is the key. And that's why the book is called Re-Embracing. So you remember, but now you have to embrace it. See, the key is once you remember it, now you have to take it in and start utilizing it. That's what the ancestors want. Hey, keep moving forward. And so as a segue to just a short thing is when you start to remember and you start to re-embrace, then you have to start changing some of your concepts. So I don't consider myself to be a descendant. I'm an ascendant. That's what my grandmother taught me. She taught me that as a very small. She says, no, you're an ascendant. I said, well, why am I an ascendant? She said, because think about it. You were born by your mother and your father. Your mother and your father were born by their parents and their parents. They're not descending, you're ascending. Because now you take the Sankofa piece, you look back to the past and you bring forward the ideas of what your ancestors have taught you. So you should constantly be growing. So we're always growing. So you're ascending, not descending, just like you were talking about dismemberment and rememberment. The same thing. You're not descending, you're ascending. So you want your children's children to constantly prosper and to figure out ways that they can better do it as a community and unity.
Irma, jump in.
Well, I like this idea because for me, it gives power to why I've created this Black Feminist Archive, is to preserve not just the past, but to build on that. And I'll just give you an example. Someone read an article about the archive and contacted me. She had a friend who's in a nursing home, and this elderly woman who I discovered was Black had built up this library of Black books. So she wanted to give them to the archive. Well, the more we started digging deep, it turns out she was at the beginning of Head Start. She's like in her mid-80s. She was at the beginning of Head Start. I found a paper in which her name is mentioned, as one of the authors from the 1960s. She's also what we would call, she's not a formally trained artist, but she's done amazing artwork. And so I was able to get someone to interview her and talk about, why did you collect those books? And in some ways, it's her trying to make sure that she can remember. And so suddenly this person who, for all practical persons, isn't an extraordinary person, but a very ordinary person, but who has this memory, this legacy that she now wants to carry on. this process of us remembering in order to ascend is also the need to archive and protect, because we cannot count on these institutions to tell our story. They're trying to erase us in the same way that they took away our languages. They're now saying you can't teach critical race theory, which was never taught in schools anyway. But they're trying to say students should not be able to learn about African American history. And I don't think people realize, but the state of Arizona eliminated Latino studies a decade ago. You know, they said you could not teach this in school. So we have to be, as Kojo is doing, we have to be, the keepers of our own memories as well as our current experiences, so that there can be a future.
My DNA places me as a Yoruba. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to use this technology that allows me to remember in ways that I couldn't before. And what it says is that science of DNA has a secret power to bring up that which was hidden, which was intended to be destroyed, which was intended to be hidden from us forever. And now with science and with the study of genealogy, we are able to reconnect. And I, just as you've connected your parents in their passage on your grandparents, their passage on the Clotilda coffin, I am discovering people here who I have a direct great-great-great-great-grandfather connection with in a place called Port Harcourt in Nigeria. And we haven't made a physical connection yet, but it'll come. The other thing that is important to me about the conversation we've had is the one about language, the power of language, and our capacity, our facility to understand language, and language as part of our meaning-making assets, right? We use language to make meaning of existence. And we have to examine how language has been used against us, but how we have overcome and resisted, permanent resistance, Dr. Gnammankou says, and the consequence of that permanent resistance is part of the continual discovery, continual creativity that we bring to each other and consequently to the world. The world suppresses the truth of our creativity while it robs it from us. The world's system of extract our bodies from the continent of Africa, extract the minerals from the continent of Africa, extract the ideas, the genius, the creation of our people all over the globe. But now we are beginning to see that for what it is. And I think in a position, in the advanced position, it's a continuum of our presence all the time. Our resistance is permanent, but we're able now with technology to create more, connect more, remember more, and determine that we can collaborate, create partnerships, relationships that move us forward as we define forward. I want to show one thing and then I'll come back. What we've done at my newspaper, Dr. Gnammankou, is created a section of the paper that we call Afro-Descendientes. And I'm going to show that to you right now. This is a story about the new human rights commissioner appointed by President Lula in Brazil. And the point I want to make is that this story, its presentation in our English language newspaper is in a section that we call Afro-Descendientes, but the story is repeated 7 times over 2 pages in different languages. We present it in Spanish. It originates in Portuguese, the language of Brazil. We translate it into Spanish. We translate it into French and English, but we also translate it and present the story in Swahili, in Yoruba, and in, I think, Somali. And that's because there's a huge Somali presence here. Now, the question is, Al McFarlane, why are you doing that? Who's going to know all those languages anywhere, and particularly in your neighborhood in North Minneapolis? My answer is that we don't know. And my answer is that I believe that presenting the idea that these are the many, among the many modalities that we can use to communicate will spark the idea in a 5-year-old, a 9-year-old, a
Yes.
20-year-old linguist, and that we have to be comfortable and intentional in owning our capability and our awareness and ability to use all the modalities at our disposal. So that's my comment, and I wanted you, the translator, Dr. Gnammankou, to respond to that, because you've seen that, I'm sure, in other places around the diaspora.
Yes, indeed, indeed, it's a very important contribution to understand more who we are. And when you see in the diaspora, let's take an example in Africa first. Even now, people think that we didn't have, regional languages in Africa in the past, which is untrue. In West Africa, we used to call one of the main languages Lukumi. But Lukumi language is in fact the ancestor of the Yoruba language. And the Lukumi language was spoken in all the Western African coast and the Western African central part, from Nigeria through current Benin, Togo, Ghana, till Ivory Coast. So this language was spoken. And the other thing is that people don't know that Africans have invented the greatest number of writing systems, of scripts, etc. And African writing systems are so different. The signs, for instance, we were talking about the memory. It's important to know that, for instance, in Vodou convents in Benin, in the Vodou convents of Benin, the members of those convents have scars on the body, and those scars are living memories, living archives of parents who were deported in the Americas.
Listen,
so even today, you can see that.
Doctor,
you can be given that.
I hate to do this. We're out of time. We have a time limit here, but thank you so much. I want to have this conversation again and build on it. Dr. Irma McClaurin, thank you, my friend, for curating this important conversation and for your work. And Brother Kojo Adisa, thank you for your work and your presence in Mobile. I want to invite you, the viewers and listeners, to be with me tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I'm going to continue our conversation with Sister Mildred Muhammad. She is the former wife of John Allen Muhammad, who was known as the Washington, D.C. Highway sniper, a man who killed a number of people in an effort to finally murder her. She survived. But we're talking about abuse in families and how we survive that. It's part of our program tomorrow. It's the Healing Circle, 1 o'clock. Join me tomorrow. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you then.